I'm Bill McNally. Welcome to America's Future. My guest today is Lieutenant Commander Frank Nulton, retired from the U.S. Navy. Lieutenant Commander Frank Nulton was Admiral Joy's flag pilot during the Korean War. We'll get more into that. And also, this is a part 2, at least for me, of the Veterans History Project. I plan on submitting this interview for storage in the Library of Congress, and you can find out about that from the website that will be shown on your screen. Welcome to Windham, New Hampshire, Mr. Nulton, and thank you for driving all the way here from Biddeford, Maine.
It's a pleasure, sir.
Thank you. Let's start with, well, I know that the History Channel always wants to know the date of birth. You were born November 5th in 1927, so if we take 2007, we subtract from 2007, 1927, that makes you 80 years old. Pretty good. And you were born in Newark, New Jersey, right?
That is correct.
Correct. Okay, I guess we're going to start off here in the year 1946, because this is when you entered the Navy at age 19. Why don't you pick it up there? You're going into the Navy as a midshipman. Is that correct? Okay.
Bill, you know more about me than I do at this stage in the game. That's wonderful.
That's good, yeah. So tell us about the career, starting from your entry into the, it's a midshipman program, correct?
Yes.
And that's, of course, you entered the Navy at 90 Church Street in New York City, correct?
Correct.
Correct. And then went from there into this program. Tell us about it, how this program worked, or what you were doing.
During World War II, the Navy felt that it had sufficient pilots trained to actually complete the war with Germany and then with Japan.
And what year was that they determined they
1944, approximately a year before the war was over.
They didn't want to train any more pilots.
That's right.
Okay.
So they terminated flight training for purposes of aviation.
Right.
It was an aviation midshipman program that was started as an interim measure to allow the Navy to start training more aviators. And we were going to be the next aviator crop, if you will, from which junior officers could be made. It was sort of interesting. We were considered midshipmen as though we were going to the Naval Academy, and they get $50 a month. And because we're in aviation, which was hazardous duty, we got an additional $37.50.
But was that during school?
Was flight pay while we were in school.
Yeah, because it was hazardous. They consider that hazardous just because you were training.
That's right.
You weren't in the war at the time. But,
that's right.
Right.
But and by the way, if you try to train pilots, you know it can be hazardous in large quantities. And so as a result, we became, when we graduated from the flight training, we became midshipmen with wings. Now, a midshipman is not a commissioned officer. He is an appointed officer.
Okay.
The same as the Naval Academy. And so we joined the fleet during the Korean War as aviation midshipmen. And it meant that we got a total of $50 basic pay, $37.50 flight pay, and our mess bill on the carrier was $30 a month.
Wow, 30 a month?
30 a month. In addition to which, we had to buy our own uniforms and things of that nature. So it was sort of a lean, mean program. And those of us that were in it did it because we loved to fly, not that we liked the pay schedule. And so I graduated from flight training, and I flew in my advanced stage in flight training an old World War II B-24, a 4-engine bomber.
And where were you doing this training?
down in Corpus Christi, Texas, after I'd left Pensacola.
What, Pensacola is where you did your
Basic
got
flight
your
training.
wings, so to speak.
Yes, and did our carrier ops and that sort of thing.
Okay.
So then after that, I was sent out via various schools until as an aviation midshipman, I joined a squadron in Whidbey Island up in the state of Washington.
Now, you didn't mention, I have to ask you, were you actually flying off carriers at this Pensacola?
At Pensacola, we actually qualified on a carrier.
You did qualify.
The Wright.
Okay.
It was a cruiser hull with a flight deck on it.
All right.
And so then in advance, they didn't have room for any more single-engine pilots, so I went through four-engine training in the old B-24, the Navy's version of the B-24, which is a PB-4Y2. These names will drive you up a wall. And so I learned to fly a four-engined aircraft. And then when I left there and via various schools out on the West Coast, I ended up in an aerial mining squadron flying P-2Vs, a twin-engine, large Navy twin-engine aircraft. In fact, a P-2V was the aircraft that flew from Perth, Australia to the United States, probably the longest twin-engine flight in the history of aviation, until we had air-to-air refueling. So put it all together, and the squadron that I was in deployed when the Korean War started, and our mission was to mine.
What year are we in now?
And we're now getting to 1950.
1950.
And in 1950, the Korean War started in the late summer. And because the squadron had a mission that looked like it was a one-way mission, because we were going to aerial mine, the Soviet Asian Fleet Center. And those types of flights, usually you just do one time because you don't live through the operation itself. And so they dropped off all the extra people and reduced the crew size so that not too many people would be lost in doing the job that had to be done. Well, I was dropped off because I was one of the new officers in the squadron, and that was as an aviation midshipman. Some other aviation midshipmen deployed with the squadron. Well, I was asked one day to accept a task of picking up an aircraft down at Lockheed Corporation down just outside Los Angeles and fly it out to Japan, and it was going to be Admiral Joy's flag aircraft. Spelled, it's an airplane that has been configured specifically for very senior officers, and it had a large armored box inside the aircraft. And that's where, when we were under fire, we would have our passengers get in this armored box, which would take a 40-millimeter armor-piercing hit and shed it. In other words, the people inside would be safe. So I went down to Lockheed and lived at Hollywood and Vine in a hotel for about 5 weeks while I got checked out in the aircraft to fly it and to do whatever had to be done. And then we flew it out to Japan. We got there just in time. We got in at 10 o'clock at night. Beds were found for us in Tokyo by the Army. And the next morning at about 3:30 in the morning, I was awakened, and they said, "You have a flight." And with a full 3.5 hours sleep, we went out to Haneda Air Force Base, climbed in the P-2V with Admiral Joy as a passenger and a number of other very senior officers. And we took off, and being one of the three pilots, we all in the Navy, we rotate jobs and seat positions during the flight. And I started off as the navigator on that flight, and we took off from Tokyo, Japan, and there's an island just south of Tokyo and Yokohama, and it's called Oshima. And I asked the pilot, I said, this has been interesting so far, and I'm learning a lot, but what do we know about our destination so I can figure out a flight plan to the destination? And they said, we're not going to be given the destination until we get over Oshima, which was then another 20 minutes away. And so I got out all the gear to start navigating as soon as I knew what the destination was. And 20 minutes later, I got a call. Do you know where Incheon is up in Korea? And I said, I've heard the name, but I'm not too familiar with it. I'll have to look it up. So I looked it up in our various documents, and I found that it was up on the west coast of Korea and very close to where a very good-sized community, fishing community and harbor was, and that sort of thing. And the pilot said, I want a course to get us up there. So I was operating from the same map that I had flown in from Hawaii via Midway, where we refueled, and then back into the air for 11 hours to get to Tokyo. And I had my 3.5 hours sleep, and now I'm navigating up on the west coast of Korea to the area of Incheon.
What time of the time frame are we in again?
In the fall of 1950.
Okay.
Okay? So as we came up to the area, the pilot said to me, what are you reading on the radar scope? And I said, I'm looking at somewhere in the area of about 30 or 40 ships in the harbor of Incheon. And the pilot said, please go back into the flag compartment, notify Admiral Joy that we'll be over the Incheon fleet and have an estimate for that. And I did, and I went back and informed Admiral Joy, and he said, wonderful. Set me up with the following frequencies, and his communicator that he had in his group handed me a list of communications and so on. So we started to patch Admiral Joy in to his fleet commander in 7th Fleet. We orbited the Incheon landing in Korea for about 14 hours. And Admiral Joy was in contact with his fleet commander down on the battleship that he was on.
Which was?
And I can't remember which battleship we had on the West Coast at that time, because we had one on the East Coast and one on the West Coast, and I never knew which one had been rotated in and out. So we just, but we had his frequencies, so we were in good shape. And we orbited so that the Admiral could talk, our Admiral, Admiral Joy, could talk to his fleet commander and mention things that he felt the fleet commander should know. But being on a battleship, he doesn't have the same ability that Admiral Joy does of overseeing both the land operation as well as the shipboard operation. So we orbited that completely. We orbited it thoroughly through the day, and we didn't leave until about 11 o'clock that night to head back to Tokyo. Well, General MacArthur was so happy with the information that Admiral Joy had brought back from his having observed the landing and such.
And where is General MacArthur at
General
that time?
MacArthur is back in Tokyo
Okay.
at Meiji headquarters,
Right.
okay? And so the next time General MacArthur wanted to go up to Korea to see what was happening and so on down the line, rather than fly the Columbine, which was an absolutely tip-top shape, four-engined aircraft, a Lockheed aircraft, and it was just beautiful, polished to a T, and just wonderful. But it had been fondly named the MiG bait of the area. In other words, with Soviet MiGs, with both Soviet and North Korean pilots, and their aircraft outperformed our aircraft significantly. And so they called General MacArthur's aircraft MiG bait. And General MacArthur understood that, and he said to Admiral Joy, may I use your aircraft when I want to go up where the MiGs have control of the skies and so on? And Admiral Joy said, MacArthur, Mac, it's yours. So as a result, we flew both Admiral Joy and MacArthur whenever they went up into the forward areas of the peninsula activity. I can remember it wasn't a war according to the normal classification, and so therefore the police action or whatever we were. And it was under the United Nations. Now, you've got to understand why the Incheon invasion was so important, because down in the Pusan perimeter at the foot of the peninsula, which is Korea, we were isolated into an area with sort of a half-moon effect at the foot, and every single inch of the area we owned, the enemy could land a shell on, whether it was an artillery shell or a mortar shell. And I know that from experience because I was flying people into the Pusan perimeter, and those people were coming from the States and immediately being shuffled up to the Pusan perimeter because we had to defend that. It was our only foothold at the time. But we were taking an awful beating. And the men coming in, I can remember dropping off a whole plane load. It was DC-3, what we call an R-4D, about 30 men. And they didn't have rifles, they didn't have steel helmets, they didn't have any of the things they needed to fight with because they had just been sort of taken off naval facilities and ammo dumps and things like this. And with a duffel bag, they were flown to Japan, and we in turn would fly them into Korea. And in order to have combat gear to actually go up on the line and fight, somebody had to die, and you had to get the body back and take the helmet off and all the equipment, so he had his gear to go up and actually man a position. This is how bad it was. And we would get mortar rounds and artillery rounds while we flew people in, and then came back to get more to fly more in. So it was a very difficult circumstance, and MacArthur wanted to make the Incheon landing typical of what he had done during World War II with the Japanese in the South Pacific. And it was a case of a very horrible situation. Now, when MacArthur asked to make the Incheon invasion, he sent his request, needless to say, back to the Pentagon, and the Pentagon looked at it and said, well, this is a presidential type decision, and it was sent up to President Truman, and President Truman in turn notified the United Nations of our intention, and the word came back, no, you can't do that. Interesting? So when word got back to MacArthur that Truman said, no, you can't do it, the Pentagon said you can't do it, and he said, MacArthur said to Admiral Joy, can you get me some amphibious lift spelled to carry people to make an amphibious landing. And Admiral Joy said, well, I'll talk to Commander down in Hawaii who owns the Pacific and see what he can do for us. And when Admiral Joy 2 days later was talking to General MacArthur, he said to him in the aircraft, he said, the Admiral said, how much lift do you need and how soon? Mac said, I need them yesterday, and I want to be able to transport somewhere in the area of 20 to 40,000 men. And Admiral Joy mentioned to him, he said, you know, the United Nations is probably not going to be happy with that. What MacArthur did not know at the time, what Admiral Joy did not know at the time, and I did not know at the time until I read some material from the John Birch Society, that the person in charge of the New World Order's United Nations, the person in charge of military activity had to be a Russian.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay? So a Russian general was in charge, and a Russian general had turned down MacArthur's recommendation that this Inchon invasion take place. And so I can remember when Admiral Joy mentioned to MacArthur that everybody turned him down. And nobody understood why. And nobody understood that a Russian general was in charge of everything. And needless to say, everybody was informed of the Chinese and the North Koreans and everything by the Russian general in the United Nations in New York. And so when Admiral Joy said, they're putting together the lift for you, he said, how are you doing on troops? MacArthur said, I've got people that will give me the troops I need to do it. He says, now we have to get the ships and the people together to get them up there. And Admiral Joy said, well, the United Nations might be unhappy about this. And I'll never forget Admiral Joy looking at him and said, Turner, if it's good for the United States, we do it. If it's good for the United Nations, that's nice. If the United States has to listen to the United Nations as to what it's doing, he said, we're damn fools. And he said, we aren't damn fools, and we're going to do what's best for the United States. And the United Nations can do whatever they want. After the invasion takes place and we cut off the lines of communication and supply for all the troops in the South that are killing our guys down in the Pusan perimeter, he said, after all that's over, he said, I'll discuss it with anybody who wants to talk. So Admiral Joy said, I'll continue to press for the ships. Everything was put together, and we orbited that landing that took place at Inchon. And MacArthur was overjoyed, and
So
it solved
you actually
the war.
watched that Inchon landing?
Completely. In fact, we had to change frequencies a number of times because other frequencies were blocking us out. And I had an entire book about that thick of communication frequencies. And it was quite an experience, and it was...
No, during that landing, MacArthur and Joy were where?
MacArthur was back in Tokyo, and Admiral Joy was in the aircraft orbiting and talking to his fleet commander.
With you or?
With us, inside the aircraft. And we were just orbiting at about, we started at somewhere in the area of about 6,000 feet, and Admiral Joy wanted a little better perspective of the fleet maneuvering as well as the men going ashore and such. So we climbed about midday up to about 12 to 13,000 feet, and then we dropped down again because night was drawing high. The tide was going out. Destroyers were almost lying on their side on the mud because it was their 5-inch fire from their 5-inch weapons that were supporting the troops that were hitting resistance from the North Koreans. The North Koreans never should have been in a defensive position there because there was no reason to. And that was the thing that disturbed me most. Why, when we were pulling a surprise attack, did the enemy have troops there when there was no reason to have troops there? And that's why later on, when I read the John Birch Society analysis of the situation, I saw where they had been informed that this was an intention of MacArthur.
Wow.
So, put it all together, when President Truman relieved MacArthur and his replacement took over from him, our casualty rate of Army troops and other military units increased about 35%. MacArthur, while I attended some of his briefings in Tokyo as well as others because he had invited me for whatever reason he did, he evaluated the objective versus the cost in manpower. And many times I heard him tell generals, General, until you can get your risk rate down to this particular set of numbers, it's a no-go. The men are too valuable. The goal, while desirable, is not worth the casualty rate that you presently expect. You show me how a new casualty rate will come out of a new operation, and if it's appropriate, in balance, you'll have it. Until then, it doesn't go.
Excellent. You know, there's just so much that we learn about this Korean War, and like I say, we're here because of people like you that protected us, and I really thank you for that service. Now, I know you're going to stay around for do another show, and this is going to be a good one because it's got to do with your career in Tokyo itself. So I think we'll sign off, Frank, and thank you once again for coming. I'd like to thank the Cable Studio, and we have two guests here. I'd like to thank Edgar Sargent and Terry Sargent for coming over from Merrimack, Mass. To visit with us, and thank you, the viewer, for watching.